Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining the webinar this afternoon. We're just going to give it a minute or two just to see how many more people we can join, and we'll start very shortly. Thanks for your patience. Hello everyone, thank you very much for your patience. We were just waiting a couple of minutes for other people to join, but we're going to make a start now. And thank you very much in advance for your time over the next 45 minutes or so. I'll start by introducing Eunomia and our webinar series, and then I'll give an introduction to myself and my colleague Dr. Tom Raven, who will be leading the majority of the content today. For those who don't know, Eunomia is an international independent environmental consultancy and research organisation. We work across the circular, natural and carbon economies, and across these themes we provide data-driven and evidence-based research and consultancy to clients across the public, private and NGO sectors. We've got over 23 years of experience, and our 150 employees are working across offices in the UK, Brussels, New York and Auckland. We're a values-driven business providing independent, respected and impact-driven advice. This is part of a series we've been running throughout the year called Fit for the Future. And it's just about helping our clients staying aware of upcoming sustainability legislation and some best practice advice about how to navigate that. So my name's Richard Waters. I'm the head of strategy at Eunomia, and I'm delighted today to introduce my colleague, Dr. Tom Raven. He's a senior consultant and leads our biodiversity and nature-based solutions work. He's got a PhD in evolutionary biology from the Natural History Museum in London, and regularly works for both public and private sector clients on biodiversity, including the links with climate change. He's our focal point for our interactions with the TNFD forum, and he'll be running today through the role of nature and the TNFD in your businesses. A little bit on webinar etiquette. So the microphones should be turned off for everyone, and the chat box is also disabled. However, we want this to be interactive, so you should see a Q&A function, and please do use that to ask any questions. And we've left about 50 minutes at the end where we will try and get through as many of those as possible. Any we don't get through, we will follow up offline afterwards if useful. And then the last bit before I pass over to Tom is just to sort of introduce the structure. So we're going to cover four broad areas. Firstly, the nature crisis. So I imagine you're all acutely aware of it, but we're just going to allow Tom just a little bit of time to talk about the challenge that lies ahead and why it poses risks to organisations. We're then going to introduce the TNFD and bring that to life for those of you that aren't familiar with it, and then explore how it can be used and how it can be approached to help you navigate and understand the risks and opportunities that nature provides for your organisation. Finally, we'll talk about some practical next steps about what you can do to take this forward in your organisation as well. So without further ado, I think we will crack on. So over to Dr. Tom, and yeah, enjoy the next 30 minutes or so.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. So yeah, Hi everyone. And first of all, I want to talk about nature before I jump into what the TNFD specifically is. And that's because I always start this conversation, this discussion, with a stark reminder of the kind of difficult situation we're in when it comes to nature. We need to look at the science and the evidence around nature, and we need to be able to respond to it. And that evidence is pretty bleak. So in 2024, 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, only one of which is climate change, were transgressed. And this is shown in the figure on the right that has that quite alarming amount of red and orange. A recent academic paper in Global Change Biology has also suggested that ocean acidification as a planetary boundary has also been crossed. And so the pace of change is really accelerating. Similarly, the WWF's Living Planet report has highlighted the average change in observed population sizes of nearly 5,500 terrestrial vertebrate species. And this shows a decline of 73% in average population sizes over the last 50 years. And this increases to 85% for freshwater species. This is coincident with a species extinction rate that is over 1,000 times higher than natural background levels, indicating we're already in a mass extinction event. And this is all being caused by mainly 5 drivers of change: habitat loss and degradation, which is caused primarily by our food system, as well as other extractive industries, as well as general development, is the most reported threat to wildlife populations around the world. But this is also followed by overexploitation of natural resources, invasive alien species, and pollution. And then climate change also interacts and underpins a lot of these other drivers. And this really does matter. So our society is 100% dependent on nature, and I don't think that's a surprise. But while levels of dependency vary across economic sectors, over 50% of our economy is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So for example, a few years ago, the World Bank calculated that reduced pollination, fisheries, and timber production caused by the nature crisis could result in an annual decline in global GDP of nearly $3 trillion by 2030. Nature is therefore embedded in our societies, in our businesses, and our financial systems. And this diagram on the right shows that there are complex interactions between nature and businesses in both directions. So businesses can impact nature, but they can also depend on nature. And these impacts and dependencies create both risks and opportunities, which together are termed nature-related issues. And these nature-related issues are rapidly evolving given the nature crisis I've just mentioned. So therefore, there are some clear strategic implications for your organization as you aim to become resilient in the nature crisis. And to give some more details on these interactions with nature, in particular the impacts and dependencies. So nature is broken down into different ecosystems across land and the ocean. And in any of these locations, there exists a complex arrangement of environmental assets and ecosystem services. Ecosystem services being the flows of benefits that these assets provide. And so impacts and dependencies are how organizations interact with these assets and ecosystem services in either direction. So again, how that organization impacts on those components of nature, or how those components of nature are depended on for an organization to operate. And some dependencies will be more obvious than others. Pollination by insects, which supports crop production, is a classic example. But these also extend to things like seagrasses, providing water filtration services that support the aquaculture and fishing industries. So a degradation in seagrass habitat would reduce this ecosystem service, therefore negatively impacting fishing yields available. Similarly, impacts are when organizations change the state of nature. So an obvious example would be a mine or an agricultural company requiring a degree of habitat clearance. Whilst these impacts can vary, they can be positive or they can be negative, and they can be direct or indirect. So that agricultural company or that mine can also subsequently end up with a positive impact by either using regenerative agricultural practices or by a quarry creating biodiverse habitat at the end of its operational life. And there is a strong self-interest to act on the nature crisis and to reduce and mitigate these impacts and dependencies. This action can be driven by either regulatory or stakeholder expectations, especially considering that, like its climate cousin, the TCFD, becoming mandatory in certain jurisdictions, TNFD will likely in the future become a compliance requirement. At the previous biodiversity COP, there was a large push by the Business for Nature Coalition to make this happen. This action can also be driven by the desire to mitigate nature-related risks and become a more resilient organisation, such as by reducing risk in your supply or value chains. And finally, this action could be driven by the desire to position the organisation as sustainability leaders to enhance your reputation, especially important given that the nature crisis is a really visible outcome. There's real public desire to contribute to a nature positive world. Eunomia can support with your action no matter how these three motivations you fit under, and the TNFD provides a really good framework for supporting that action. It recognises there is variation for each organisation and their reason to act, meaning there's an inbuilt flexibility, but it provides a degree of standardisation that ensures consistency and comparability between organisations and sectors. So then I'm going to move on to specifically what the TNFD is and therefore how it can help your business. And the TNFD was launched in 2021 by a coalition of founding partners. It aims to develop a framework for organisations to report and act on evolving nature-related issues. It was modelled after the success of the TCFD, so the Taskforce on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, and it aims to shift global financial flows towards nature-positive outcomes. There were 7 founding principles to the TNFD, stating it needed to be market-led and based on science, it needed to be globally inclusive to include a whole of society approach, and it needed to be integrated and adaptive to cover the climate-nature nexus. It also needed to be purpose-driven so it can help actively reduce nature-related risk and increase nature-positive outcomes. After 2 years of development and consultations, TNFD's framework and disclosure recommendations were launched in 2023. And these help organisations assess and disclose their dependencies and impacts on nature. It introduces the LEAP approach as a methodology to guide nature-related risk and opportunity analysis. But the TNFD does not exist in a vacuum. It actually builds on decades worth of previous work to conserve and restore nature, and it continues to innovate and evolve today. So having that global focus means there are linkages right back to the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, which is also called the Rio Earth Summit, and this led to the Convention on Biological Diversity being established. This has since organised biodiversity COPs, which are similar to the more familiar climate COPs but held every year. And these COPs have produced several global agreements, including the Aichi targets in 2010. Ultimately, these Aichi targets failed, and their failure led to a renewed effort to produce a global agreement at COP15 in 2022. This became the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which has 4 key goals for 2050 and 23 targets for 2030. And the TNFD specifically integrates closely with the Global Biodiversity Framework, in particular Target 15, which aims for businesses to assess, disclose, and reduce biodiversity-related risks and negative impacts. And so in a bit more detail, the TNFD provides that framework for understanding how nature-related risks and how they are linked to organisational resilience, strategy, and financial planning. Ultimately, it supports understanding how these things all affect both business performance and sustainability performance. It breaks down this risk into different types of nature-related risk. So you have systemic risk, which are broad risks affecting the general stability of both ecosystems, as well as the financial system that we operate in. There are physical risks, which are split into acute risks, such as extreme weather events, as well as chronic risks, such as the long-term degradation of land or water sources. And then there are transition risks. These are the risks that arise from the transition to a nature-positive global economy. So this includes things from different policies and laws, as well as changing public perception that affects organisational reputation. And then the usual market risk and technology risk that businesses are accustomed to, but which are being accelerated as the bigger picture changes. The TNFD supports taking that integrated approach to consider all of these things, and it can help better understand how nature impacts organisational performance, and just as importantly, how the actions of organisations can impact nature. But what do I really mean when I talk about the TNFD? So I've mentioned that it's a framework and it's one that is standardized yet allows some flexibility. That may seem counterintuitive, but I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Firstly, there are the TNFD disclosure recommendations. These are the outputs of reporting using the TNFD framework. So for example, by producing nature strategy reports that align with the disclosures. There are 14 recommended TNFD disclosures covering 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. And I'll talk about these more later, but it's useful to note that if you can publish TNFD aligned disclosures by financial year 2026, you'll count as an early adopter of the TNFD. By highlighting these 14 disclosures, it provides that consistency between organizations and between sectors, despite the detail of those disclosures potentially differing quite a lot. Not all 14 disclosures have to be disclosed initially, and it's particularly important given the TNFD is designed to be flexible enough to accommodate different approaches to materiality. This means that you can determine what is most important to your organization. In addition to these recommendations, there's a vast array of additional guidance. This covers guidance for specific sectors, and there are currently 16 different sectors covered, so forestry, finance, aquaculture to pharmaceuticals, and a lot more. There's also guidance on specific methodologies, so scenario analysis, or how to deal with your value chain, or how to set nature targets. Importantly, there is also guidance on engaging with Indigenous peoples and local communities, given that we can't solve the nature crisis without the real custodians of nature. This guidance is all suggested by the TNFD, but it isn't required to make those earlier disclosure statements. And finally, a core component of this additional guidance is possibly the thing that most people will end up associating with the TNFD, and that is the LEAP approach. I'll go through the LEAP approach in more detail shortly, but to summarize, it's a standardized methodology that supports organizations to identify and assess nature-related risks. Again, the yellow triangle at the top, the TNFD disclosure recommendations, they're the component which technically qualifies you to become an adopter of the TNFD. The rest of this framework provides that additional guidance that can support you getting to that point of adopting and disclosing those TNFD recommendations. And the TNFD doesn't exist in a vacuum, as I've said. It wasn't actually designed to be in a vacuum. It's been designed to be compatible with frameworks like the CSRD, the ISSB, and the SBTN. So reducing reporting burden and enabling sustainability, integrated sustainability action. In case you're not on top of your alphabet soup, from left to right in the table, CSRD is the EU's recent Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This is undergoing potential changes due to the Stop the Clock and the Omnibus simplification packages, but it still touches on biodiversity. For more information on CSRD, I'm going to signpost you to Eunomia's earlier webinar in our Fit for the Future series, so please reach out to us if that's of interest. But the TNFD can be used as the framework for acting on the CSRD's biodiversity requirements. ISSB are the standards set by the International Sustainability Standards Board, and this is subsumed to the TCFD, which is the Taskforce for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This was the earlier framework that focused on climate change, but from which the TNFD has taken inspiration from and built a very similar structure for recommendations. There are consultations ongoing on the ISSB about further linkages to the TNFD, so raising the likelihood that, like the TCFD, the TNFD will also become mandatory in coming years. Then finally, SBTN is the Science-Based Targets Network. You might be familiar with the SBTI, which is the target setting for climate change, and the SBTN extends this target setting to help set science-based targets for nature, covering land, biodiversity, freshwater, and the ocean. TNFD recommends the use of methods developed by the SBTN when setting those science-based targets for nature. And again, Eunomia can provide support for those looking to set SBTN targets. And so there are many benefits of aligning with the TNFD and becoming an adopter of its recommendations. It's really seen as best practice for acting on nature. It provides that integrated approach with other sustainability frameworks, in particular for acting on climate change through the ISSB/TCFD. And I think this is especially important given the scientific linkages between nature and climate change. By being a standardized framework, it increases transparency and comparability, so it allows better communication with your stakeholders. But it's also flexible, so you can start with what is most important to you today and expand the depth and breadth of action over time. And it's comprehensive. It's designed for any business of any size, of any sector and any geography to be able to use it. And finally, it provides that systematic approach to identify and manage nature-related issues, which I'll go through in a second. And so you might be wondering now, how do you even start dealing with an issue as complex in nature, and how Eunomia can help you with your next steps? And so whilst the disclosures are the bit that technically mean hitting the TNFD requirements, I'm actually going to start in chronological order because the disclosures come at the end of your journey. Before you get there, you would use the LEAP approach, which I mentioned earlier as the standardized methodology used to identify, assess, and manage nature-related issues. You don't need to become, technically need to do this to become an adopter of the TNFD. You'll see there are many benefits to using it, and it's really seen as best practice for acting on nature-related issues. Before we jump into the details, just a few things to note. This will also often accompany a scoping phase where the quick high-level scan of internal and external data allow the generation of a hypothesis around potential nature-related issues, effectively defining the parameters of the full LEAP assessment. The LEAP approach will also involve a lot of consultation with relevant stakeholders, both internal and external to your organisation. And finally, like TNFD as a whole, the LEAP approach is flexible in its approach. So you can iterate across different phases, and it can be applied in different orders depending on your current capabilities and areas of focus. And LEAP is another acronym in that alphabet soup of sustainability. So it stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And there are 16 components within those 4 stages, and each aligning with certain recommended disclosures I'll discuss later. The locate phase is all about identifying and understanding an organization's interface with nature, both in terms of geographical location, but also which activities touch on nature. In locate, your organization should look across the span of the business model, identifying sectors, operations, and value chains with potential moderate or high nature-related dependencies and impacts. You can do this by comparing credible reference sources, and techniques such as heat mapping using tools such as NCORE can help. Other tools such as IBAT can be used to identify protected areas and threatened species, and you'll need to use GIS analysis to map and organizational locations. By the end of this phase, you'd want a list of potentially material activities and a list on map of locations that need assessing. The evaluate phase is then about developing an understanding of the organization's potentially material dependencies and impacts on nature. So essentially involving moving from a list of potentially material dependency impacts that were previously identified and moving towards a more detailed description and evaluation of those dependencies and impacts. This includes both a measurement of both, as well as an assessment of how material they are. And because of the complex interplay between organizations, dependencies and impacts, and those of wider society and other external factors, this stage would require engagement with a wide range of stakeholders. Outputs from this stage would include a list of relevant environmental assets and ecosystem services, and a list of how an organisation depends and impacts on these, and which are material to the organisation. The assess phase is then about which nature-related risks and opportunities are material and which should be disclosed. So it builds on the identification of impacts and dependencies and how these translate to risk and opportunity. This would include those risk categories I mentioned earlier, so physical risks, transition risks, and systemic risks, and the timeline of these risks needs to be considered. It would also include looking at opportunities to create positive outcomes, So this is by either creating positive impacts on nature or by mitigating those negative impacts on nature. And the outputs from this stage would be initially a long list of relevant risks and opportunities, then a short list of the most material risks and opportunities, and an identification of priority locations, and then finally a method for adopting risk processes, and such as taking the existing ISO risk management guidelines and adapting them for considering nature-related risks and how to integrate that into your organization. Finally, the prepare phase is about deciding how an organization should respond to those material nature-related issues that have been identified earlier. So this includes deciding what should be disclosed and how. It's also about how to adapt governance and risk management processes, as well as the setting of nature-related targets and goals, which, as I mentioned earlier, would be aligned with SBTN methodologies. There will need to be a discussion with internal stakeholders about how to respond to nature-related issues, and you'd need to take into account the short, the medium, and long-term perspectives. Outputs from this stage would be an agreement on the response to take, including identification of appropriate resources, as well as the production and then publication of a set of TNFD aligned disclosures. And that takes us nicely on to disclosure recommendations. So these are the bit that, as I mentioned, are actually constituting adoption of the TNFD. And these disclosure recommendations are split into 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. So first of all, governance. This is all around the processes and procedures that organizations use to manage nature-related issues. So this could be about the boards and management's oversight of nature-related issues, as well as the policies the organisation has on human rights and how these interact with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Strategy is then the approach used to manage nature-related issues. This could include the actual dependencies, the impacts, risks, and opportunities identified in the LEAP approach, as well as the effect these issues have on the organisation's operations. It could also include a description of the resilience of an organisation's strategy to risks and opportunities, as well as the specific locations of activities that are of a higher priority. The risk and impact management pillar is about the processes used to manage the nature-related issues. So it's the how to identify, assess, prioritise, and monitor those issues. Effectively, this is the methodology used in the LEAP approach, and that's both for direct operations as well as upstream and downstream in your value chain. Importantly, this is also about the organization's ongoing processes for managing nature-related issues and how they're integrated into other organizational processes. And finally, the metrics and targets pillar is around the actual measurement of organizations' performance in relation to their nature-related issues. There are literally thousands of metrics that could be used to assess a relationship with nature. Thankfully, TNFD and others have done a lot of work already in the space, and the TNFD focuses on a small set of core global metrics that apply to all sectors, some core sector metrics that apply to specific sectors, and then a larger set of additional metrics which are recommended for disclosure when they are relevant. So this disclosure pillar is all around disclosing which metrics have been used to manage and assess nature-related issues, and subsequently the targets and goals used to assess performance. And at this point, you might be drowning under very specific TNFD jargon. So to break that down into some manageable chunks, I think you can really focus on 3 key work areas, and hopefully you'll be familiar to these from other sustainability work. So first of all, nature footprinting, which is analogous to carbon footprinting, but thinking more broadly around nature, is that foundational step for any organisation preparing for TNFD aligned reporting. So it helps to produce measurable and manageable data that can drive informed decision making. And then because nature conservation is really at the nexus of natural sciences and social sciences, you really need deep engagement with stakeholders. This is critical to reveal hidden risks and dependencies, but also to improve data collection and management and to enable the full LEAP assessment across your whole value chain. And finally, dealing with nature risk is all about dealing with future uncertainties. And so scenario workshops can really help test your assumptions and test your current work, and that can help build resilience, inform strategies, and support least disclosure. Particularly, this can strengthen the prepare phase of the LEAP approach. So with all that in mind, and the knowledge that the TNFD recommendations were released in 2023, what are early adopters doing? And it's still relatively early days, but over 500 organizations representing more than $17 trillion in assets under management have already committed to adopting TNFD recommendations. I just wanted to provide a quick flavour over this early work. I'm going to talk about one case study from a financial institution and the different stages of the LEAP approach they took to understand nature-related issues. Initially included a scoping phase, which was effectively a literature review to identify the relevant data and also the skills and capacity needed. Next was a screening stage, which was using the on-core dataset to establish high levels of impacts and dependencies and identify the most material ones and removing the tail of lower risk companies within their portfolio from their next steps. Next were separate portfolio level and company level analyses. At the portfolio level, this was a higher level, so it used ESG data as well as on-core. And then the company specific analyses were broken down into the 5 IPBES drivers of nature loss, allowing identification of which companies to focus engagement with initially. This culminated in a publication of progress. The organisation were open and honest that it was a work in progress, that the assess and prepare stages were still needing to be completed in the future. And because there's been a number of early adopters, there's been research into the general experiences of these. So challenges from these include the reliance on external datasets, where they have little control over, but also given how nascent this topic is, it's also a challenge was identifying appropriate tools to use. And internal data itself was also seen as a challenge. Many organizations lack the appropriate data collection and management systems for nature-related data. And lessons learned include the realization that this can be an iterative process. It's complicated and it doesn't all need doing at once. But given the urgency of the nature crisis, getting started as soon as possible is really important. You can then improve this process, including data and monitoring over time. And this improvement is especially true if there's collaboration with more biodiversity-focused organizations. So at this point, you might be thinking, what does this mean for me and my organization, and how can you know me to help? And that's how I will finish off quickly today. So you may be in a couple of different camps, given the nascency of this area. I'm going to assume most people here are getting started on their nature and TNFD journey, but you also may be more familiar with the TNFD and looking at ways in which to focus your efforts. And you know me can support with your next steps, no matter where you are with your preparation currently. This could include building on today's discussion and providing support to navigate the complexities of the TNFD requirement, or it could help by building a business case and approach that secures that internal buy-in from others in your organization, including your leadership. We can also provide nature literacy training to your organization if that's of interest, and to support any of these things. So please do reach out if any of that is of interest. But our support could also include dealing with the more technical aspects of your work, whether that is the early steps of data collection or by moving on to the LEAP approach and identifying and analysing your nature-related issues. For example, through nature footprinting, through stakeholder engagement across your value chain, or through scenario analysis. And finally, we can provide ad hoc support for any particular or unique queries you may have. And I think it's important to highlight why Eunomia can help and where our strengths overlap with the requirements of the TNFD. And so firstly, we focus our efforts on systems change, and that's particularly important when thinking about dealing with systemic risk. So we have expertise across the carbon, the circular, and the natural economies, and our work touches on both the policymakers and the corporates and everyone in between. So we know how to implement the required actions on a day-to-day basis. Because of that comprehensive approach we take, we've got a particular expertise in complex supply chain, and that's where these nature-related issues are likely to arise. Again, this holistic systems-wide approach means we have that technical expertise across the natural economy, so from biodiversity to water and everything in between, and particularly how these components interact with each other. Finally, our approach touches on the required components. So you're going to need to engage people across your value chain, and you know me as the deep social sciences expertise extending to scenario analysis that is required. But we have the complementary data-driven expertise, including in GIS, which is needed to understand the spatial assessments of nature. And so to summarize today's session, the scale and speed of the nature crisis, driven by those 5 drivers of nature impacts, means there is a real urgent need for societal action to stop full ecological breakdown. And that nature crisis has material risks to organisations. Put simply, we can't survive on a dead planet, and we're 100% depending on nature. And so the loss of nature poses material risks to organisations that cannot be ignored, meaning strategic responses are needed. The TNFD is a game-changing framework that can help organisations understand and act on nature-related issues and increase resilience, whilst also providing opportunities to positively contribute to nature restoration. But thankfully, the complicated and urgent issue can be tackled today by taking some practical steps. That could be the first steps in nature footprinting, engaging with your value chain, or looking into scenarios of nature change. And we're on hand to support you with these next steps. With that, I'll pass back over to Richard, and thank you all for listening.
Tom, thank you so much. Really, really interesting content, and appreciate you walking through that for everyone. For those of you that are still looking at the screen, you'll see there's a couple of QR codes which might be interesting. So one links to our LinkedIn page, and then if you'd like a callback and a further conversation, there's a second QR code. We're going to do just a few minutes of Q&A, and I've actually got some questions as well, which I'll sneak in if that's all right, Tom, just to put you on the spot. You talked about this 14 recommended disclosures. That feels quite daunting. How long should an organisation sort of pencil in to get from 0 to those 14 to be credible? Are we talking months and months here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like I said, it's the TNFD framework is flexible, and it provides that flexibility to start with what you can do and iterate and improve over time. So it will take, it's a complicated issue. It will take a few months to get started, but you can probably within 3 to 6 months get a good step of the way there. To get across all 14 disclosures and to do a full assessment, it might take more like 12 to 18 months. But that very much depends on the style of organisation, your geographies. If you're across a global, if you're in a global organisation across different continents with different kind of activities, it'll be much more complicated. But yeah, everyone, and that's part of the global process, is that every organisation can start today. There's easy, practical steps that you can start with.
Okay, that's great. I noticed earlier one of the drivers you had for acting now is it's probable that it'll end up being mandated in some form, potentially for more, perhaps for larger organisations first. So if you were an SME, do you think there's still value in looking at TNFD and seeing how it could help your organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're completely right that the mandatory focus is likely to be for larger corporates and financial institutions. But as I mentioned, the material risks can apply to any organisation of any size in any geography. It's really difficult for SMEs to be able to act on this. There's potentially less of budget available. Some of the data out there is more aligned to be at a global higher level, but there are a lot of support available. So there's a lot of free guidance from the TNFD itself, as well as a lot of other free software available. So things like Encore that I mentioned, and a bunch of other tools and resources are available. And that's getting started with any part of the TNFD process, I think, is really important. And the sooner you start, whether you are an SME or a larger corporate, the effectively the cheaper it'll be, but the better it'll be for your long-term resilience.
Okay, thank you. I know from an earlier webinar we ran that one of the challenges of Scope 3 carbon reporting is the need to engage with the supply chain and try and get robust data. I think you half hinted at this earlier, but I'm assuming there's a lot of sense in trying to consolidate those efforts in terms of things like data requests and getting a really good understanding of the supply chain of an organization and helping to look at those risks and opportunities in aggregate. Is that a sensible approach to take?
Absolutely. Yeah. The engagement with your supply chain, if it's a complicated supply chain in particular, that's going to be one of the biggest issues here, especially when it comes to data collection. There's a good chance that a lot of organizations have already started with some form of carbon and sustainability work. And so starting with that and considering how that existing data and those existing contacts in your supply chain can support the move to broader nature related work, I think that's a really critical way to go about this.
Okay, no, that's great. And then just going back to this theme that I think for some of our audience, it feels quite daunting. And as you've said, Tom, we can absolutely handhold organisations through the process. It is part of that potentially not looking at the whole organisation initially and thinking about, a smaller part or a particular business unit. Is that a good advice for organisations to take forward sometimes?
Yeah, definitely. It's everyone understands in this space that it's a very complicated issue and that nobody's aiming for perfection from day one. Even in public policy nature conservation, we've been iterating over time and we're still getting things wrong. So trying to apply that to the private sector and for an organizational approach is really complicated. So yes, absolutely. Starting with what you can manage on day one, and potentially that being focusing on a certain activity, a certain geography, or certain part of your supply chain or value chain, that is a really good way of piloting this and thinking, what's the process we need? How would we then expand that across the whole business model, the whole value chain?
Okay, and then we've got about 30 seconds just for one more question. So Ramesh has asked about when you're adopting TNFD reporting, does that mean that other reporting might not be required because there's some sort of consolidation and consistency across different reporting architectures? So I think you mentioned earlier they're trying to make it as easy as possible to be adopted. Can you just talk for 20 seconds on your view on that, please?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's complicated, but there are lots of ongoing efforts to align those reporting frameworks and those specific requirements. And thankfully, there's a lot of kind of cross collaboration tables so you can identify which to, if you need to go through the ISSB and the TNFD, which bits to focus on and how to go about that. Yeah. Brilliant.
Okay, Tom, thank you so much. We're out of time. I hope people that stayed to the end of it has found it really, really engaging. This will be recorded and we'll share slides to the participants as well when as we wrap this up. As a reminder, the QR codes are there, and feel free to reach out to myself or Tom or just through our website if you'd like to have a further conversation with us. We'll be delighted to help. Thank you, everyone.